So often God surprises us. Moses thought so. As a young man, he thought he'd bring about revolution. He ended up on the backside of a desert for the next half century or so. And finally, when God called him, Moses was already 80 years old. Time to retire and slow down. Besides, Moses didn't have any gift of speech. He wasn't comfortable. It was a bit surprising that God would call in an 80-year-old. Mind you, I have more and more sympathy for 80-year-olds, I have to say. Habakkuk thought it was a bit surprising, too. God is surprising. He could understand how God could use a regional superpower to chasten his covenant people because of their idolatry. What he didn't understand was how God could use a regional superpower which on every graph was socially more corrupt, was morally more corroded, was more violent, was more destitute of grace and godliness than the Israelite people that they were sent to chasten. How could God do that? Paul thought that God was a bit surprising. I mean, he could pray for people and they would be healed. He saw the hand of God's power in the alleviation of illness. Now he has this thorn in the flesh, a messenger from Satan to torment him, and he prays and God says, I'm not going to do it. I'll give you grace instead. Which initially didn't satisfy Paul at all. He prayed diligently, setting aside repeated times for intercessory prayer, until Paul learned, my grace is sufficient for you. So often God surprises us. And then, of course, there's Abraham, promised this son who finally showed up, and then God tells Abraham to slaughter him. But one of the things that is most striking about the gospel is that at its heart, it is a gospel of surprises. Who amongst the apostles anticipated that God would redeem his people by sending his son to die for them by taking their place? Who expected Jesus to rise from the dead? Not the women who went to the grave. They had ointment to pour on his body. Not the apostles. They were busy hiding in an upstairs room. They weren't saying, yes, I can hardly wait till Sunday. They were scared they were going to be arrested and crucified themselves. The gospel is the gospel of surprise. And despite all of the passages from the Old Testament scriptures that anticipate the coming of a Messiah who would be a servant, slaughtered lamb, glorious king, a triumphant conqueror, and a bleeding sacrifice. Despite all the scriptures that talk along these lines, many of them using typology rather than mere verbal prediction to point in that direction, the truth of the matter is, it wasn't by and large picked up. Which is why when Jesus walks with the two on the Emmaus road after the resurrection, he can rebuke them and say, oh, fools and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have written. Ought not Christ to have suffered? Fact remains, it was a surprise. So when we come to this passage where Jesus demonstrates that he is himself the resurrection and the life, the passage is marked by surprise after surprise after surprise until we come to the greatest gospel surprise of all.